Hi, BookTube, and welcome to another fiction review. Really excited about this review, actually. No, wait a minute, not the review precisely. What I'm excited about is I finished this book in December, and it was the last on an 18-book TBR list that took me 18 months to complete. So you can just imagine the excitement about completion. Completion excites me. But okay, I'm excited too because of the author. It turns out that when I looked back on my records, this will now be the fourth book that I've read by this author. So I just want to begin like this, ta-da, with a big celebration for finishing my winning titles TBR. That was 18 books that I selected from my own shelves. I already owned them. In most cases, I'd owned them for more than a decade, but at least a decade, and hadn't read at all. And I picked them, I remembered, because I was very attracted to the title. And that's the case with today's book. So now we transition smoothly into the next slide. We are going to look today at A Desert in Bohemia by Jill Paton-Walsh, published in the year 2000. And it's 330 pages long, but that's a deceptive number of pages because my paperback copy had 14-point font. I'm not joking, big font, and also a little bit of space between each line of text. So I figure that if it had been printed differently, it would come under 300 pages. And you can see that because it's been around so long, it's easy to pick up inexpensive copies online if it turns out this review has you interested in purchasing one. It is historical fiction. I should put a caveat on that. Although it is based in history, the geographical place, as you'll see, is fictionalized somewhat. And I think that's just for the protection of privacy, perhaps. I'm guessing that. I don't really know. The novel begins with a quote from Shakespeare's play, The Winter's Tale. And that's what you see up on screen now are these two lines that appear before the novel proper starts. Enter Antigonus, carrying the babe with a mariner. Antigonus, thou art perfect then? Our ship hath touched upon the deserts of Bohemia? Mariner, aye, my lord, and fear we have landed in ill time. I don't know this play particularly well, but I believe there may be close parallels between the novel and the play in the sense that this is about people departing from the place that they lived and coming somewhere else. But of course, it also refers to the deserts of Bohemia, which is a little bit of a joke, really. I'll explain what I mean. But first, we must talk about our author, Jill Paton-Walsh, or if I give her full name, it is Gillian Honorine Mary Herbert Baroness Hemmingford CBE FRSL. Okay. Her writing career actually splits into three parts. You could say that from 1969 to 1993, she was mainly a children's author, and she just had one adult work that was published back in 1975. It was in 1993 that she switched to adult fiction, and her first novel, Knowledge of Angels, came out that year, and that was the first Jill Paton-Walsh novel I read. She then went on to produce 5 more adult novels during the 1990s, and they would all be classed, I think, as historical / general fiction. She also, and I did not know this, produced 4 detective stories centered around her own character, Imogen Quee. And in 1998, she completed an unfinished manuscript left by the late Dorothy L. Sayers, which was one of the Lord Peter Wimsey series. If you know that, you'll know that. And she went on to publish 3 more Peter Wimsey stories of her own. The last of those was The Late Scholar, and that was also her last published work because Jill Paton-Walsh died in 2020. Now we go back to this business about The Winter's Tale, because the novel is about refugees, people who were made homeless in the immediate aftermath of the Second World War, just because of the sheer destruction in parts of Central Europe. And so to accentuate the reader's sense of what it feels like to be displaced and unsettled. The narrative moves forward in time, but it also shunts you from character to character and from place to place. So you feel a little bit unsettled as well. Now, The Winter's Tale, of course, refers to this deserts of Bohemia. So the actual geographic setting is what is now the Czech Republic. But Jill Paton-Walsh, for some reason, doesn't want to name the area that she's set her characters in as Bohemia. Although it is Bohemia, she has an author's note at the back which explains that there is no such country as the one that she does name in the novel, which she names it Comenia. But she says it may be supposed to share borders with Bohemia. The joke with The Winter's Tale is that there's supposedly this ship touching upon the deserts of Bohemia, but the Czech Republic is, of course, a landlocked country. There is no salt water near it. There are some rivers that can be navigated, but I don't believe that was what was meant here. And I'm not sure I understand what he means by the deserts. Shakespeare, I'm not sure if he knew the geography of the landscape he was describing when he talked about Bohemia in the play. So there's a little bit of a joke that she's used this, but then set the novel itself in a country based on Bohemia, which is much more forested and green. I think the desert might really refer to more the barrenness, the emptiness that people feel because they have to leave their homes and the places that they grew up and where generations of their family grew up, and they're not certain whether they can ever get back to those places again. The novel begins in 1945, and it follows the lives of 6 people who come together by pure chance inside an abandoned home in a small town in Comenia. As they hear about Soviet troops advancing, they split up, and the rest of the novel allows the reader to visit each of them at different points in the future up to the 1989 Velvet Revolution, which ended communist rule in what is now the Czech Republic and Slovakia. And it goes a little further, up to 1991, when some refugees were returning to those regions. And I was going to say Comenia, but it's so weird to be talking about factional and fictional places in the same review. But they come from the various countries to which they'd fled, and also, they see individuals who stayed inside the country. You see how their fortunes changed over time and how it feels when communism ends for those who have lived under it for that period of time. Or, in addition to getting back to those places, whether anything that they owned or their families owned will still be there or not. So the desert is sometimes information or family heirlooms, etc., or connections with people, something like there's a dearth of that because of their having to flee the country and the regime change that came when the Soviet Union took over what is now the Czech Republic and had it as a Soviet satellite state. And if we zoom in more precisely geographically, this area of Comenia or Bohemia that we're in is within a very short walking distance of the Austrian border. And that's interesting because, of course, it means that area, if we go back before the First World War, it would have been part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And the borders would have been much softer. And it means that there are aristocratic families who own land and property both on the Austrian side of the border and on the Czech side of the border. The book actually begins with that soft border hardening as the Iron Curtain forms after the Second World War. And so some characters, they know they have to flee. They must get into territory controlled by the United States or Britain as part of the occupying forces because they'd be considered enemies of the new communist state. Others stay. They're perhaps looking forward to communism. They think it will bring some benefits, but then they do later themselves, in spite their best efforts, become enemies of that state. Jill Paton-Walsh examines all of these different personal situations. What's also interesting about the setting in time, though, is that because there is so much trauma in the minds of those characters as they begin the book, some of them have seen horrific things, they sometimes decide to cut off their own past. They make a decision to try to erase it or put it behind them because they can see that it would be dangerous for them to remember it, too difficult for them to remember it, so they cut it off. And then you have this business of, as they move forward in time, they question whether they should perhaps look back, whether maybe forgetting that past was not a wise decision, or deciding to just ignore that part of themselves is not a good decision. It's an interesting look at what happens when people have to leave a part of their identity behind. And what do you do with that? What do you do with those memories? What do you do with that identity? If you are never going to get it back, or you fear you're never going to get it back, what do you do as a person? How do you give yourself a fresh, strong identity? Viewpoint is third person, and it moves from character to character. What's interesting is that you might shift viewpoint character but not shift place, or shift place without shifting viewpoint character. This is all part of that unsettledness, which I think Paton-Walsh manages really well for the first 100 pages of the book, as everyone who was in that one place at the beginning moves out and tries to get themselves re-established, tries to ground themselves and settle and have a life post-war. The other aspect of the book that I think I should mention is that initially, for the first 57 pages, you really don't need to know more than these 6 characters. You're sort of with them in a little bubble. Then, as they branch out, as they have to leave and resettle, you do get a few more characters that become associates, friends, work colleagues, new family, as these people settle down in the countries that they choose to settle in. And so you do find that you probably get altogether about 20 to 25 characters. So it's not a big demand on your memory in terms of remembering all the different names and so on. And I always talk about mobility. Mobility, of course, in this novel is key. The refugees, they're core characters, but they can suddenly become stateless, homeless, or when they go to the state that they once thought was theirs, it does not see them in the way they see themselves. And any resources that they were able to take away with them are usually very, very few. They leave a lot of things behind. So it as you say, it carves out this emptiness, and perhaps that's the desert in Bohemia, is that inner emptiness that many of the characters feel when they just have to go with very little notice, taking very little with them, not sure when they'll see anyone they know again. It creates a strange emptiness that they have to decide how they're going to fill in order to keep functioning. Problematic content. Well, within Soviet-occupied Romania, or as we know it was, Bohemia, the Communist Party had surveillance methods to watch for any activity that they considered to be threatening to the state. So several times in this book, characters are warned and threatened, and after they're warned and threatened, they're arrested. And so the reader has this steady diet of peril and tension, and they never really know what's going to happen to the characters after their arrest. But the readers never put through, I don't think, the ugliest post-arrest treatment. If anything, I think Jill Paton-Walsh tries in the narrative to give you the results, what happened indirectly via another character. There is a threat of sexual assault at one point in the book, but nothing is described. Today's rabbit hole. I checked back in my reading records, and I was surprised to find that A Desert in Bohemia is actually the 4th novel by Jill Paton-Walsh that I've read. Now, you know, if you followed my videos at all, you know that it's unusual for me to read most of an author's work, any one author's work. I don't think I've read all of any author's work. So I had to ask myself, what is it about Jill Paton-Walsh's writing that works for me? And I came up with a couple of things. Firstly, I would say that Jill Paton-Walsh seems to have a personal discipline for writing active sentences. That is, sentences which begin immediately with the subject of the sentence and followed by the verb and the object. She likes that. You don't get often indirect sentences, or sentences that begin with a gerund clause, like while he was waiting for X, blah happened. She doesn't do any of that. And it also, her sentences, mainly 1 or 2 clauses long. You get the occasional longer sentence, and that feels quite interesting. It gives you a sort of a sudden speeding up, as if you were traveling on level ground, so to speak, metaphorically speaking. And then suddenly there was this slope where you could just coast and go a little bit faster. And the other thing is that when she writes scenes where two characters who are very close are talking to each other, a husband and wife, mother and daughter, two lifelong friends, she makes those, they're quietly presented, but they're very full of feeling. And I want to read an excerpt now. It starts on page 153 of A Desert in Bohemia. I want to talk about the two characters, though I should. Jiri and Eliska. They've been a couple for perhaps 30 years, and they live in communist Bohemia, or Comenia, if you will. Jiri has spent 3 years in prison for the crime of being curious and wanting to read books about socialism. Yeah, I know, but that's how crazy it got. So here's the passage. 3 days later, abruptly, Jiri was released. He had served half his sentence. He was not allowed back to his farm. He was given a job sweeping streets in Krasnov. Eliska joined him in a one-room flat on the outskirts when she left the mental hospital a few months later. He tried once to explain to her why he had signed the dreadful paper about her, which Slamomir had extracted from him. She didn't want to know. Of course, Jiri, do you think I thought you'd done it freely? What do you take me for? In there, nobody believed a word of it. Everybody but you understands these things. Eliska was deeply happy in those days because Nadezda's Vincent had got a job as a draftsman in the town architect's office, and they were talking of having children as soon as they could afford it, and Eliska thought they would be able to afford it. And Eliska, she would sell a few more links in a certain gold chain, much shorter than it used to be, certainly, but with some of its chunky segments left. She had never shown Jiri this. Instinctively she knew it was a capitalist hoard. She had far more sense than to tell Nadezda, who had given it to her. It was hers. She had earned it in ways she had not always found easy, and which included not telling her family where their occasional treats came from, making sure nobody ever asked her about it or why she had been given it. Nadezda had evidently let something drop, because Jiri did ask Eliska about a chain that had bought the train fare for a prison visit. That was stupid of Nadezda, but then she loved her father. Eliska would have kept it in the dark from Nadezda too. When Jiri asked, "What's this about a gold chain?" she said, "I came by it honestly, and that's all I have to say about it." "But what am I to think?" he asked her. "What have you been driven to while I was away?" "Oh, come now," she said. "You know me better than that after all these years." But when he let the matter drop, she was appalled at him. Eliska saw well enough in those days that the world had turned to lead in Jiri's heart, but she treated him like a sulky child. No, she murmured to him, "There is no such thing as St. Wenceslas, and the moon is not made of cream cheese, and the Russians are not our comrades. You should have been here, Jiri, to see the tanks in the streets of Krasnov. That would have shown you." "What would it have shown me?" he asked. "What the world's really like." "So what is it like?" he asked. "Terrible. We are just animals, really, greedy, murderous beasts. But it breaks your heart that things aren't as good as you hoped for. But they aren't as bad as they might be, either. Sometimes there is a little kindness, or a bird singing in the garden, or a child to love. We have a roof over our heads, and we have each other. That, above all." He was silent. "Jiri," she said, frowning with the effort to find words, "we have to believe that the bird singing is as real as the pit. Otherwise..." "Otherwise?" "We have to believe it, because otherwise it might not be true." Jiri put his head in his hands and shed tears. "They won't keep you sweeping the square forever," she said. "There aren't enough good farm managers. The harvest is bad again this year." Jiri said, "I don't know what you see in me." Eliska was peeling the potatoes into a bowl on her knee. She paused and smiled at him. "You are such a boy," she said. "Do you know, when we met, you had a gun in your hands, and you asked if you could come to bed with me, just like a schoolboy, and I had had enough of men." "So long ago," he said, wonderingly. I should have thought the effect might have worn off by now. No, she said, still smiling. Not completely, not in spite of everything. Jiri said, Eliska, may I come to bed with you? She laughed and said, just wait while I finish the potatoes. And that's the review done. See my description box if you're starting to get interested, because you can read a 30-page sample of A Desert in Bohemia online. So that might give you, more of a sense of, is this book for me or no? And I also just want to say, so excited again that my winning titles TBR is done. We're going to start a new TBR. And I realized that I had that logo for my winning titles TBR, but I didn't use it for each video, which I should have done. I'm going to make a new logo, I think, for the new TBR, which is called Alphabet Soup. And the only reason it's called that is that I've picked 26 books where the surname of the author begins with a different letter of the alphabet. And I'll explain that more each time we reach a new book. And I'll probably start it. I have this thing, I might start it like, do you remember The Electric Company? Does anyone remember that children's show from the 1970s where they would start by saying, this episode is sponsored by the letter R or the letter M. So I might start my reviews by saying this review is sponsored by the letter R if I happen to be reviewing the book on the alphabet soup list where the author's surname begins with R, etc. Anyway, that's by the by. In the meantime, you all have good reading. Don't worry about me. I'll sort myself out. And I'll talk to you again in a couple of days' time. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.